So today's session is about co-ops, and I'll be running through what is a co-op, briefly why co-ops, mostly talking about models, models of co-ops we actively set up at Co-ops UK, where they're useful, where they're not, how to set one up, because I understand quite a lot of you are leaders or work within third sector organisations. You may well be looking at the co-op model as a potential new enterprise or converting your existing enterprise. So that's kind of what I'll be talking about. By all means, ask questions or we can take it in a different direction if that's the way it goes. So I'm John, I'm Head of Membership at Co-ops UK. Co-ops UK is the national network. We're the national network for all the co-ops in the UK. There are about 7,000 different co-ops of different shapes and sizes and in different sectors, which I'll go on to explain a little bit about, but that's really where I work, and the majority of my day-to-day work is, as I mentioned, helping people set up co-ops, mostly nowadays to solve community problems in their community that for whatever reason they believe a cooperative is the right way, the right solution to solve that particular problem. And that's what we do for a living. We're not government funded, we're mostly funded actually from members. As a co-op, we're funded by our members supporting us either through subscription because they believe in what we do, or by actually paying for the advice and support they get. So we're not a charity, we're not government funded, we are supported by the sector. So just to kick off, and it's always difficult to do these sorts of presentations because I really have no idea the level of understanding people have. But so I will start with what actually is a co-op, what am I actually talking about? So if you're anything like me, or the vast majority of the people who come across co-ops, your initial thought is, oh yeah, that's where I get my tea and coffee from, or my baked beans, or my local convenience store. If you go a bit deeper than that, you might think, oh yeah, the co-op, they do fair trade. They do fair trade tea and coffee. They're quite an interesting business. They're quite ethical. That's really the vast majority of what people think about what a co-op is. What we deal with on a day-to-day basis, as I say, is yes, we deal with those sorts of co-ops. Yes, there are co-ops that have been going for hundreds of years now that do operate in convenience. That's what they do. The vast majority of the co-ops I work with are much simpler than that. They are a group of people coming together to run a business to meet their needs, and really that's at a core what the co-op is. It's a business, it's not a charity, it is a business. Mostly, pilots nowadays, social enterprise, all co-ops are basically social enterprises, but they're businesses and they're owned and controlled and primarily for the benefit of their members. And that's really the core difference between what a co-op is and lots of other business forms, is they're absolutely rooted in their members and who their members are. And that's really what drives the whole concept of what a co-op is. Who are their members, you may say? Depends on the sort of business it is, sort of place they operate. The typical co-op you see on the high street selling tea and coffee, their members are their customers. Whereas nowadays, a lot of the businesses I work with, their members are employees or groups of freelancers, groups of taxi drivers, or members of the local community who've come together to solve a particular problem. And so a co-op is, as I say, it's a group of people who become members in a business, and that business is there to meet their needs. The other thing I tend to say is one of the big things that separates a co-op out from, say, a PLC, Facebook and Tesco of this world, is those sorts of businesses, their primary purpose is to maximize shareholder return. That's what they're in the business of doing. They're there to maximize profits. They might have good social impacts or good CSR programs, but ultimately they're about maximizing profits for their shareholders. Whereas a co-op might operate in a similar industry, a similar sector, might run in a similar way, but their goal and the goal of the organization is to maximize member benefit. That might mean good quality products. It might mean ethically delivered and thinking about what the impact of that business is in that community. And that's really what makes co-op different than a normal private sector business. What makes it different from a social enterprise is a co-op, it's not just the social impact the business makes, it's how it's owned. So again, one of the big differences between a typical social entrepreneur story and a co-op story is a co-op is owned by loads of people who all own that business democratically, whereas a social enterprise might only be kind of led and controlled by one individual. And that's really one of the big differences. What do they look like in reality? This image is really the sorts of people I deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's a really interesting cross-section of the sorts of organizations, the sorts of things they're trying to do, the sorts of needs they're trying to meet. What's interesting, I suppose particularly for this audience, I'm guessing, is from a diversity point of view, the co-op sector is pretty good from a gender point of view. We've got good representation from women on boards and in leadership positions. It's pretty good in that respect. It's also pretty good from a class situation. Obviously, co-op's kind of rooted in working class history. Not so many upper class people in the co-op movement. It's also pretty good from a sexuality point of view. That sort of demographic. What it's really poor at, and I'll put my hands up, is it's pretty poor on race. Where I live in Rochdale, there's a huge Pakistani and Bangladeshi community where I live. Very few people are involved in or understand the co-op movement. Whereas across the hill from me is a lovely little village called Hebden Bridge, and it's full of lovely white middle class people, and we've got loads more co-ops across the hill. And for me, that's just a challenge that I'm interested in, because I'm interested in your views really on what I'll come on to at the end, is why aren't there more co-ops in more diverse communities than they currently are? But I'll kind of come back to that near the end. But yeah, this is the sorts of people I deal with on a daily basis, coming together to set up businesses to solve their community's problem. Just a quick run through of who these people are, just to give a bit of flavour to it. Top left, that's a health and social care business. So that's 400 people who the employees own that business and provide health and social care services to Suffolk Primary Care Trust. And they've been going for nearly 10 years now, delivering those sorts of health and social care services. Top right, that's a student housing co-op. So it's a housing co-op, it's a halls of residence in Edinburgh. And the students own and manage a halls of residence with 100 beds, 100 rooms in Edinburgh, so a very different sort of co-op. Middle left, that's Outlandish Co-op in London. It's a tech business, like any other kind of tech agency. They employ about 10 people who own business together. Wildly successful, wildly profitable. What's interesting about that particular business is with their profits, they reinvest that in the local community in Finsbury Park, and they've run a co-working space where they help other people to set up tech startups on similar grounds to the way they've done it. And so it's a typical private sector in that sense business making a profit, but what they do with that profit is what's important to them and what makes them, I suppose, a co-op in the way they are. Middle right, this is a business called Organically. It's a agricultural business. It grows food, and again, I suppose the slight difference for them is to help them make money in this world. They also provide a lot of education and training around healthy food, where food comes from. They work a lot with schools, so they're not just a grower of food. They're also working in their local schools and local community around educating people about where food comes from. Bottom left, this is a gym in Bristol. It's owned by the gym instructors and the customers of the gym, and they basically took over a really old building, community space in Bristol, and have essentially turned it into a community-run gym. That is, again, it's a business. People have to become members of the gym to use it. But what's different is their approach really to like body image, I suppose, to phrase it in that way, and having a healthy body image and all that side of it. And again, they're owned by their customers and their workers. And then bottom right, that's Wharf Chambers, which is a community space in the centre of Leeds, again owned by the local community around it. And again, it's there to provide essentially a safe space for their members to socialise, that sort of thing. They've also got a gig venue in that particular co-op. So they're just 6 very different sorts of businesses, social organizations. What makes them all cooperatives is they're owned democratically together with their members to meet a specific need. Just to quickly say, where did co-ops come from? This kind of does come up, and it helps put a bit of context, I suppose, to what a co-op is. The concept of working with other people to run an organisation has been around for millennia, probably. What happened 175 years ago is a group of people in Rochdale, where I live, who, again, not dissimilar to where we are now, actually, in the economy, is they felt, well, they were exploited. There was very little choice. Their jobs were going. The factories were automating their highly skilled work away. There wasn't much options for where they could shop, and lots of other social and political and radical issues were going on at the time in the 1840s. And 28 people decided to get together and set up a business together to meet some of their needs. They had huge aspirations to own and control their own housing, their own work, and lots of other elements of their daily life. Where they started was they set up a shop together because it was dead easy, and they put money together into running a shop, which then grew. And the reason why we have the co-op movement is the rules by which they set up that business basically worked and were really successful and grew into a whole way of running a business. The kind of example I give is football. People have kicked a ball around for years, but I think it was some Cambridge students who decided to write down some specific rules for football that worked, and other people started playing their version of football. And so the football that everybody around the world plays today is based on those rules set out by those Cambridge students way back when. And the co-op business model is the same. It's just a specific way of running a business following some specific rules that just happen to be really successful and taken up by lots of other people afterwards. And nowadays, there's co-ops literally all over the world. There's about 3 million. It's difficult to measure these sorts of things, but there are over 3 million co-ops around the world, employing over 280 million people. And we say supporting around 1 billion people, i.e. that's the households, the customers, all the people involved in the co-op economy. And just one example, because it's great alliteration from Rochdale to Rwanda, is the Kokeki Siri co-op in Rwanda. And this is really typical of the sorts of co-ops you find, particularly in Africa, which is groups of individual freelancers, I suppose you would call them, who do individual piecework, whether it's taxi drivers or in this case, sewing, coming together through a co-op to market and negotiate on their behalf, so they're essentially not exploited by middlemen. And there's loads of examples of this all around the world. The more obvious example people might know about are things like fair trade tea and coffee, where individual tea growers get together and negotiate on their behalf as a co-op to sell their tea and coffee into the export market around the world. And that's really the cross-section of co-ops around the world. And that original shop is now a museum in Rochdale. When COVID is over, you can go and visit it. It's a museum. So I'm just going to talk in a bit more examples, because I think that's what really helps people. Oh, sorry, I've seen a question. That's a shame. Sorry, I don't have the link. I can't answer that question. So just going to talk about a couple of examples of some co-ops we've worked with before going into some of the practical steps and setting one up, and go from there. So Projects Manchester again, just not far from me in Manchester, is a great example of a community coming together in what was a difficult situation, and they've set up it is a social enterprise, I suppose, as well, to overcome their needs. So in Manchester, just to quickly go through it, the council put in a rule that stopped people skateboarding in the centre of Manchester. They essentially outlawed skateboarding. And what they did allow for is a bit of disused land under the Mancunian Way that skateboarders were allowed to use. It was dark, it was unsafe, it wasn't a very nice place to skateboard. what those skateboarders did, they came together, they lobbied the local authority in Manchester to give them that land, to lease them that land under the Mancunian way. And to do that, the only way the local authority would trust them to do that was obviously if they incorporated as a legal entity. And so they came to us and we set them up as a co-op. And so all those skateboarders became members of a co-op. That co-op basically took on the lease for that land. And over the last 15 years, that co-op has grown into I suppose, a proper community space. It has a cafe, it's fully lighted, it's safe. They've converted the very rickety wooden skateboarding ramps into proper ramps. They now employ some of those skateboarders as coaches and trainers, and they now train schools around the area in essentially skateboarding as part of that sort of, you know, health and well-being agenda. And it's a proper little business. People become members to skate in the skate park, and like I say, it's a really good use of what was a disused part of land that was taken on by that community. And like I say, it's a proper organisation. They now have raised from their members to the tune of, I think, something like £160,000, which they've match funded with grant funding, because co-ops, like a lot of other business forms, can still get grants even though you're not a charity, to invest in that park and make it into the success story it is today. And I suppose that's one of the things just to touch on with co-ops. Yes, they are trading businesses. Yes, they do rely on people paying for something, but a lot of co-ops, because of the nature of what they do, are also attractive to funders. There is some limits because they're not charity, so there are some funders that aren't accessible to them, but a lot of funders do see the community impact and the community ownership of co-ops as something they want to fund and want to support. So there are quite a lot of the co-ops we set up do start out with funded projects. So yeah, Projects Manchester are a great example of a community-owned co-op. At the other end of the scale, I suppose, of what we work with is just pure employment and well-being. And so this is Blake House, which is a film production business of two. They produce films. Yeva is Lithuanian. She came over to the UK about 5 or 6 years ago, I think, to study at university. And in the start of their career, like lots and lots of other, you know, creative professionals, I suppose, is essentially they were exploited by agencies for poor work, poor values-based work as well, and essentially very little control over their work, i.e. this is classic the gig economy stuff. What Simon and Yeva did, they decided they didn't want to continue with that. They set up a work co-op of 2 people to own and run their own small business, to kind of take back control over their livelihoods and to do the sorts of work they want to do, that they find valuable. Very simple little business in that sense, but great. They do, by the way, they do great films. I'll put some of the links there to take a look at. I will share the slides afterwards. I think they're being shared anyway, just so you know. But it's just a good example of co-ops can also be quite personal and solve quite personal work challenges for people. You can set up a 2 or 3 person co-op to run your business. And equally, some of those businesses massively grow and are successful over the years. You know, some of the co-ops we set up, you know, back in the 80s and 90s are, you know, 400, 500 employee owned size businesses. You know, these businesses do grow as well. Just quickly running through some other examples. I've mentioned all of these already. I'll skip through this. Moving into an international example, which I kind of like to focus on to talk about the scale of where these things can end up. So a lot of the work we do is working with startups. The largest co-ops in the world is this one in India. Actually, the largest co-op in the world is a bank, which is really boring. So I use this example of one of the largest co-ops. It's a co-op of 50 million people in India, and it's a federation of 35,000 different co-ops within that. And that's just at a huge scale of where these things can get to. and why I use it as an example. The other reason I use it as an example, because fertilizer in itself isn't that exciting, is what it actually means to those people. And so those 50 million farmers in India supported by their co-op, if they weren't members of that co-op and they weren't served not just with fertilizer but all the other things a small holding farmer needs, they would be exploited. They would be at the mercy of middlemen and larger organizations. And so by setting up a co-op together and becoming part of a co-op, what they're doing is getting the economies of scale and the support, a bit like a trade union, I suppose you could say, with lots of other people to get control over their own livelihood and to be able to pull a bigger weight. And that's really the story of what co-ops are all about. They're about lots of individual people who wouldn't be able to do what they wanted to do without working with other people. And by coming together with lots of other people, they can punch above their weight and punch above what they would be able to do on their own. And really at its core, whether it's, running a field business together, or whether it's being part of a fertilizer co-op in this case, that's what it's all about. It's about coming together with other people to meet your needs and basically, take control of your own livelihood or community. So hopefully I've sold you a little bit on what a co-op is, why I think they're good, for society. How do you actually set one up? I suppose what I'll quickly move on to now. So you need at least 2 people, fairly self-evident, preferably a community of interest around that. So whether it's a local community, you all have the same problem. So for example, a community space, whether it's a gym or a community centre or something like that, having a community around the problem you're trying to solve is really useful for a cooperative, because you pull on those people, obviously as customers or as workers or as investors. And a lot of cooperatives, the nature of how a cooperative is structured is it's really easy to raise finance from your membership. And a lot of co-ops set up by raising, to the tune of what, 150,000 pounds from their surrounding community of interest. And it's something you can't readily do as other business forms, but with co-ops, it's quite easy to raise finance from your members. So that's really useful. Obviously, you need to have at least the same kind of agenda, the same vision, want to solve the same problem together. It's fairly self-evident. And you need to have some of the skills or a lot of drive to get the right skills. Co-ops are very much based on self-help and doing things for yourselves. And that's really the way it's like with any other business startup, to be frank. Co-ops also are trading businesses. I've mentioned this before. They are the original social enterprise, to be honest. And that's really at the core of what a co-op is. It's about self-help and self-responsibility, about taking back that sort of power. They're trading businesses, but that doesn't preclude funded projects. And a lot of our co-ops who work in that space, have elements of both. They both go for grant funding, go for contract work with local authorities, but they always typically have some element of trade with individuals as well. I just had a question come in that I'll answer on the next slide, I think, about legal forms, which I'll come on to in a bit. Most importantly for co-ops is you've got to want to share power. And that's self-evident to some people, whereas for some of the people we deal with who are social entrepreneurs, or private businesses, the next Mark Zuckerberg's out there, that idea of sharing power and wealth with the membership is what stops a lot of mainstream businesses from wanting to become or taking advantage of the co-op business model. And it's absolutely critical to what we are. And so I'm just really honest in that. You've got to want to share power and wealth with the other people in the business. What that means in practice is it's one member, one vote at its basis. So if you invest £1,000 in the business, or you invest £100 in the business, or you only invest £1 in the business, that doesn't give you any more say than anybody else in that business. What gives you a say is you as a member. And so quite regularly with a lot of the co-ops we set up, they raise money from their community. to buy a pub, refurbish a community centre, put up a wind turbine, whatever it is, or set up a film business. But what they all have in common is they raise that money, people invest their own money in it, but irrespective of how much money they've invested, they all have an equal say in the key decisions of that business. It doesn't mean every decision in that business is made democratically. Most of these businesses have a general manager or that sort of thing, but on those key decisions at the general meeting of the business, it's one member, one vote, and that's core to what it means to be a co-op. What is a co-op from kind of the legal point of view? And I'll pick up the charity question at this point. A co-op isn't a specific legal form. You can use any legal form out there in the UK, a company, community interest company, PLC, friendly society, there's lots of limited liability partnership. Basically, any of the legal forms in the UK, you can use as a cooperative. What makes it a co-op is the way you run that business, the way you take advantage of that legal form. That's what makes it a co-op. And the core of that is that idea of democratic ownership, that lots of people come together, own that organisation democratically together, and make decisions democratically together. That's really the core of what a co-op is. And I think brings its strength, brings its resilience. Co-ops tend to be, I think the fact is something like in the first 5 years of trading, something like 80% of co-ops are still trading, whereas I think it's something like 40% for other business forms. And that resilience comes through the fact that they're owned by multiple people who have a stake in the success of that organisation. And it's both for some a hindrance for setting up a co-op. You need people to set up a business together. You need to share power and control with those people. Whereas for some people, that's the strength of the business. And that's when we say, when does it chime with what you want to achieve? If that chimes with what you want to achieve, the co-op way of running works really well. Whereas if you want to set up a business on your own, or an organisation on your own, that's absolutely okay, but that's not going to work as a co-op. Some co-ops do use the charity form, particularly up in Scotland, we find. But like I say, because there's a trading element to co-ops, most co-ops don't consider the charity the legal form at all, really, in the way they set up. You can't have a co-op as a subsidiary of a charity, to answer the question specifically, because it's got to be independently owned by its members. So essentially, a cooperative, because it's democratically owned by lots of people, theoretically a group of charities, or the same people involved in a charity could be involved in a co-op, but a co-op can't be a subsidiary of a charity. But if you want me to elaborate on that later, I can do. So I've kind of run through some examples of some different sorts of co-ops. Basically talks around what the legal kind of element of what a co-op is. Really just to say where to go if you're interested, and I'm going to spend the rest of the session hopefully having a bit of a conversation with you, if that's okay, is through our website, which is the typical sales pitch. If you are interested in setting up a cooperative, or you're interested in converting an existing business, social enterprise or whatever, into a cooperative business form, then this is kind of what we do for a living. And you can go to our website, uk.coop, start to have a look at the online guidance and tools and all the rest of it. Something else we have in the co-op sector is we have a business support program. So we actually can help people set up co-ops, providing direct, and we have a network of advisors all over the country and a funded program across the country to basically help people to start new or convert existing organisations into co-ops. And partly because that's one of the facets of the co-op movement, which is we kind of fund we don't necessarily rely on government funding to do things. We try and fund things ourselves. So a lot of our support is because our large co-ops pay for it, basically, because they want to see a whole new generation of co-ops. So there is advice and guidance on our website, and there is you can apply for the business support program that we operate to help people start up or convert into co-ops. So that was a bit of a run through what a co-op is, some examples of co-ops. But what I'd really like to do at this point, because it's a small session, is get a little bit of a conversation going, or a little bit of a your input. What I'm really interested in particularly is, as I kind of mentioned at the start, we're not basically, to put it bluntly, we're not seeing a lot of cooperatives coming out of, particularly in my world, my local Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities. And I'm interested to know, before you came to this session, what your understanding of co-ops were, what the myths you might have, or why you might think there are barriers to setting up cooperatives. That's what I'm interested in. But I hope you've got questions or things you want to ask me to help you out with what you're doing. So does anybody want to kick off with a question or a comment?
Yeah, I will, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
To be honest, I think this is probably one of the first times I've really heard what a co-op is actually about. I think I had a very basic understanding, but nothing concrete really. And I'm just starting work with a group that we're networking with at the moment called BLAST. It's for Black social trading organisations, and we're looking at how all the different organisations within that network group can set up their own group, and this might be something that could work for them. I suppose my question is, would it work? Has it worked in the past for groups of different social enterprises, social trading organisations who have got all different legal entities and different company forms? Would a co-op that's set up for them to come together as a group, would that work?
Yes, in theory. Obviously, we want to get into details of exactly what they're after, but so some examples that do work. So, for example, quite a lot of the citizens advice bureaus, for example, a lot of the citizens advice bureaus as individual businesses come together collectively into, I suppose you'd call it a consortia, I think you'd call it, of they're all businesses, they're all charities, I think, but they all come together. And the reason they come together is to get some services delivered to all of them through a cooperative organisation. So yes, it can work, and it can work with lots of different. If the reason they're coming together is to pull resources to achieve something, either as a bit of a joint venture, either getting a funded project in to deliver something that then farms out to all of the different organisations, or they're coming together to market something together or purchase something together, that's when it works really well.
We've only had one meeting because we were just brought together as a networking group with some funding that was around, and we've just had one meeting yesterday, so it's really new. But the purpose that we've decided we want to carry on the group together would be to come up with some sort of package that we could then market to local authorities, schools, and each individual company within that would do their own, what they do best, and have like a course, if you like, of what people can buy from us and pick out different modules and different support. And
yeah, in that sense, definitely. So we have quite, so at a small scale, because it's quite a good way of explaining. So quite a lot of artists come together as independent artists, and they either own a gallery, an art gallery together, both to do the artwork, but also to sell the artwork. And there's a place to hold it together. So they're all independent freelancers in that case, but they come together to market their collective goods, for want of a better term, in art. We also see it a lot with tech agencies, creative agencies, where again, if you have a particular professional skill that works really well alongside a similar professional with their skill, rather than having to to be independent, they go together as a creative agency, even though technically they're freelancers. So we see that sort of model working. So there's no reason why it wouldn't work at an organizational level.
And then how do each individual company, do they get the payment for the service that they've provided, or does it all come into the co-op umbrella and then get split out equally?
It can happen in different ways. So what people tend to do is, if it depends how they branded it. So if there's basically a brand at the top, which they're all underneath, then it makes sense for the money to come into that website or that contractor who takes it, essentially, you know, pitches the work, gets the invoice, but then once the money's come into that cooperative, virtually all the money flows out of that into whichever organisation actually did the work, and it just becomes part of the agreement that they're working together. And again, this is the sort of thing that happens in the private sector all the time. The difference now is, kind of come back to this with a co-op point of view, the difference with a co-op is it doesn't matter whether you're a really small partner in that organisation or a massive partner in that organisation, you all have an equal say in it. And that's what makes it different, is everyone's got an equal stake in the business, and that's what makes it a cooperative as opposed to just a private sector joint venture. That's how, but like I say, if you've got a really practical thing, I think you can do it through the Hoover platform, but do contact me afterwards and I can have a catch up with you about actually practically doing something. But I'm conscious of time and other people's questions. Edward, I think you've got your hand up. If you're on mute, Edward, if you want to ask a question.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I've been interested in the sort of cooperative arena for quite a while. I've worked around cooperatives and involved or connected with quite a few, so it's something I'm quite familiar with. My big interest at the moment is some of what you mentioned around like cooperatives for freelancers, particularly as we know, like I think self-employment is going to be a big thing going forward. And also around the fact that you can, you mentioned to it, but didn't name it specifically, I think, around things like community share offers. So a lot of what we've mentioned in this fora is about not depending specifically on grant funding, and community share offers is like a one way of addressing that. Specifically to your question around maybe some of the challenges why the BME sector has not been attracted to cooperatives in your experience. I mean, I can only kind of speak on the Black and African diaspora community because that's what I'm most familiar with. But I would say it's interesting that you might have seen that, because I think it's not untrue that they're not interested. Maybe it's more just that a lot of the sectors that seem attracted to the cooperative movement, maybe as a sector, is not attracting those communities to their movement or to their kind of like activities. And I'm thinking about things like the community energy sector and so on and so forth, where I'm familiar with cooperative movement. Because if you look at, say, the credit unions, which is effectively a cooperative, and things like, say, TMOs, so tenant management organizations, which many are cooperatives, there's a lot of attraction. A lot of those environments, those organizations are very familiar to people in the BME sector, at least from my experience, particularly, as I said, you know, the Black and African diaspora community. So I think it's just it's less about the model itself. I mean, overall, cooperatives are probably one of the smaller types of organizations in terms of represented in the economy. So I think it's more to do with the sector in terms of the economic sector rather than than the model itself. The other thing I would say is that having had experience, as you said, cooperatives can access funding or grant funding, but oftentimes I've been in situations where they've not been specifically excluded, but they're not mentioned either as an eligible organization. And if you don't have the confidence to actually call up the grant funders and just check, particularly like maybe like a Bencom, where you can have asset locks and all those kind of things that they're looking for. If you don't call them up and say, are you sure this is not, you know, part of your eligibility criteria, then you might just kind of turn a blind eye or just feel like, oh, do you know what? I need to be registered as a CIC or I need to be a charity because that's what everyone says. So those are kind of just my comments on that. I hope you heard all of that because I know that I was struggling to. Okay.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And yeah, and I suppose to that point, that's why it's really hard to get put across to people that cooperatives is just a way of running an organisation. It's not the legal form. And so, yeah, if you can have a cooperative kick, you can have a cooperative company or all those different forms. And so when you're looking at eligibility criteria, it's basically, if anything a social enterprise would be eligible for, a co-op probably is eligible for too. That sort of thing. On the point of an asset lock is, yeah, again, when we set up co-ops, one of the first conversations we have with people is how likely are you to go for grant funding? And if you're quite likely to go for grant funding and that's part of your business model, then we'll put an asset lock into the legal structure because that's what funders want. And so we can do that. And so it's upfront, it's really useful just knowing what sort of business you're going to be running. And yeah, to the point on community share issues, as they're called, this is a huge growth. So in our world, my world, there's two huge growth areas of co-ops. One is in the gig economy and freelancers. So usually professional freelancers, to be honest, but it does go through to couriers, bike couriers and things like that. Growth in that sort of business, around the gig economy and freelance work. And then the other huge growth area is communities doing a community share issue, raising money from that community to buy something and refurbish something, whether it's a pub, a shop, a community centre, a swimming pool, a community asset. And those sorts of two areas are the two growth areas of where we're seeing a lot of co-ops at the moment. So if any of you are doing things in those two spaces, then a co-op model might not be the best option, but it might be one of the options for you, and it's worth exploring. And what we tend to do, and we're really honest about it, is if we think a different model is better for you, we will tell you that because we want people to be successful in what they're doing. But yeah, it's a great way of raising money from a community. Yeah, I think Leon's got his hand up. And if I don't see your hand up, you'll have to shout out because I can't see everyone on my screen. But go on, Leon. I can't hear you. Might be muted or still can't hear you. Yeah, I can't hear you. If you want to put it in the chat, that might be better. While he's putting it in the chat, if anybody else has got a question. What I am going to do, just because I'm conscious of time, I'm going to put my email address in the chat. So if anybody does genuinely have any follow-up questions and all the rest of it, or practically wants to set up a co-op, then just email me and I'll do my best to answer your questions and help you out. So just picking up this question. And to the point about African diaspora, what's really interesting actually is because the co-op sector in a lot of African countries like Rwanda, but lots of other places, is quite good actually, that when those people are coming over to the UK and they're actually, we are seeing some co-ops from those sorts of communities coming through. It's just more interesting of people who, outside of that sort of recent migrants, it's that the awareness doesn't seem to be there. That's quite an interesting point.
And can I just say I agree with Ikra as well. I think Ikra, where he's talking about, or she is talking about informal co-ops. I was thinking that, it's very true. That happens all the time, informal co-ops.
Yeah, something I'll look into a bit more actually. Be interesting to look at. Leon, did you post a question, or have your sound working? Yeah, if it's like I say, if anybody wants to email me afterwards, I'm really up for that. Oh, I'm conscious of time. You've got one, half a minute for the unsolved problem. Oh, here we go. The question is, I was just wondering whether in the current context of democracy coming under strain, have you found it more difficult to build support for co-ops? Oddly enough, the opposite. What we tend to find is when the economy is going really well, people and the market is working fine, people have fairly decent jobs and all the rest of it, co-ops don't tend to be that popular. We find co-ops become way more popular when people are feeling more exploited, where the market is failing for some reason, where there's gaps in the economy. So at the moment, particularly around food banks or mutual aid, local mutual aid networks through COVID, we've seen a huge uplift in those sorts of informal co-ops coming together and, you know, collective purchasing of basic food items, for example. In the freelancer and gig economy, we are seeing a lot more interest in co-ops from that sort of area, because co-ops, like I say, co-ops tend to be more popular when people are feeling more under strain and more under pressure, or feeling more exploited, because it is hard work setting up a business. It's easier just to get a job for someone else and work for someone else. And what we tend to find is when that's less of an option and people have no option but to help themselves, that's when we find a growth in co-ops. And I think that's why at the moment, and probably why I was invited to speak at this conference, is why there's a little bit more interest in co-ops from people who wouldn't have necessarily been interested before. And on that note, and apologies for stopping, because I'm sure there are other questions, I'm going to end it there.